Hello, and welcome to live programming at the More Freedom Foundation. Today, we're going to be reacting to Avengers Infinity War, but this is not a comic book movie review. I'm not going to do that to you guys again. I think I've probably done enough of that this month. But what it is it's a reaction to one of the philosophical motivations of the big bad guy, whose name is Thanos. And I think that it actually has a lot of resonance and a lot of importance for the way that we think about the world as sort of, I guess, more or less educated, all these terms are problematic, but sort of educated people who sort of are influenced by the Western tradition of thought. I think it's actually this is, tangentially going to be talking about this one character, but I think it goes way beyond that to the way that we look at the world. Before I get into it, quick note on how this is going to go. If you're new, you may note that there's a live chat window. I'd like to warn the trolls or people who want to act trollish. Actually, we haven't had too much of that recently, and I really appreciate that. These chats are now recorded. They don't just disappear anymore, so you can't just go in and be offensive. I'm going to be keeping half an eye on the chat as it goes. As if you're abusive to anybody other than me, you'll get blocked if I notice it. So the way this is going to be structured is I've got an outline that I'm going to be working through, sort of written it out, but I'll be working through it over the next 20 minutes to like half hour. I tend to go long as a tangent in different directions. And then at the end, I'm going to answer every question that comes up. So if you have a question as I'm sort of doing my initial spiel, by all means, throw it out to the comments, discuss it, this, that, and the other thing. But let's save that question, because when I say, okay, I'm open for questions, then I'm going to want to answer all those questions, and I'm probably not going to be able to cycle back through the chat. All right, so let's get into this. Last night, I saw the movies Avengers: Infinity War, and yes, this is not going to be a comic book review. I do want to say, sorry, a comic book movie review. I do want to say that I enjoyed it thoroughly, but I always enjoy these things. I even enjoy the DC movies, which I acknowledge to be pretty awful because I'm a comic book nerd. So that sort of draws me in. But I do think, actually, that this one did a better job than the last Avengers installment in juggling all these characters, and there were a ton of characters. I think that was a real accomplishment. And also, I was a bit worried. The last time I mentioned it, I made a video about a month back that said that the Marvel movies were better than the DC movies, because the DC movies sort of focused on these big, silly, nameless threats that just there's no stakes and don't really have any impact with viewers, whereas the Marvel movies were all about family. That's what they focused on. That was their thing. And I was worried that with this newest Avengers movie, with the big cosmic villain, they were going to lose track of it. But I was interested to see that this one was basically just all about family too. So I think Marvel successfully continued its model, maybe put a little tweak on it. I thought it was a good movie. But don't come to me for that. Maybe if you guys want to hear more about it, we can talk about that later on. What I want to talk about today is the main character of Thanos. And I think this guy was sort of very cleverly, the main bad guy, and actually weirdly it seems like the star of the film sometimes, Thanos, the big cosmic bad guy. What's crazy about this character is he's might bother some of you, but he's basically a deranged environmentalist. Like, that's the vibe. He is made actually compelling by the filmmakers. It's always clear that he's the bad guy, and our heroes try to defeat him. But as with any action film, the bad guy is actually more compelling if they have a pitch or an approach that makes a kind of sense. And the thing with this guy, in the comic books, Thanos, the Mad Titan, is like legit insane, and he is in love with Death, who's actually a character who has like speaking lines in the comic books. It's the kind of crazy that you can only really get away with in the comic book form, which is why I love comic books. The filmmakers wisely decided not to do that. They gave him a backstory. He came from a planet that was killed by some kind of unspecified but probably environmental catastrophe, and he has therefore become really committed to solving the problem of overpopulation everywhere on every planet in the known universe by killing half of all people. That's his idea. It's basically he wants a cull. He wants to kill everybody. Now, this is obviously, as I said, he's the bad guy. He's set up as the bad guy. But I think it was clever of the filmmakers to set him up like this, because I think they probably want to start conversations. And as I read reviews obsessively, as the fanboy I was last night, and sort of hung around on Twitter and whatnot, I got the sense that they were successful in starting that conversation. And that comes to the question that I want to discuss today. Is Thanos right? There's the idea that what he's saying could be appealing in some sense. We hear a lot in U.S. culture about how, humanity, not U.S., sort of culture of the West, the world even now, about how humanity is a curse and humanity is a blight, and where we're creating all these extinctions and wouldn't everything just be better in terms of resources and peak oil and climate change? Wouldn't it all be better if there were just half as many people all of a sudden? So yeah, sounds kind of interesting. Isn't Thanos right? My answer to that would be a super, super emphatic no, absolutely not. That is not the case. Thanos is wrong. But I think this idea of sort of overpopulation, what have you, is really compelling to us for some interesting reasons that we don't look at. And it's not just like a left-wing or environmentalist thing. It's on the left and right. This idea that we're running out of resources and we need to do this, that, and the other thing is tremendously compelling. And it's almost, I feel like it's a bit of an illness in sort of Western thought. To put it probably too broadly. And I'd like to talk about, that's what I would like to talk about today. What's going on here is a sort of influence, an influence that goes back. Yeah. Okay, sorry. Was not as well prepared today as I would like to be. One point I wanted to make, as I go on here, I am not complaining about environmentalism in this video. I am not going to be, that's not the point of this. I actually, though I don't do much advocacy for it, I'm a big fan of environmentalists. I think that they have done a lot of good. My life in the United States today is dramatically better because of the 50 years of work that they have done. My air is cleaner. I am less likely to be around a toxic waste dump. It's been great. But just because environmentalism is vital doesn't mean that we can't look at the philosophical underpinnings there with a critical eye, because there's too much, I think, certainly in U.S. politics, and from what little I know, the politics of the rest of the world as well, where people just assume that, okay, this person has a good idea, so all of his or her other ideas must be good. So I'm just going to walk in lockstep with this person. And I think today this video is about the way that good ideas mixed with bad ideas can have really horrific consequences. I am now going to read a quote from John Maynard Keynes, or Keynes, or Keynes, or Keynes. I never really know quite gotten how to pronounce his name, but John Maynard Keynes, sort of famous British economist, I guess probably more looked to by the left, but he's got this one quote here that is absolutely amazing and is partly what we're going to talk about today. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Madmen in authority who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler of a few years back. I love that quote, and it talks about the way that we don't even necessarily know or see the influences on our own thinking. And it's especially referring to people in power. You know, Donald Trump wasn't the first person who had no idea what he was really saying. Politicians throughout the history of literate politicians have been acting in pursuit of ideas that they may not even fully understand or know that they are influenced by. Now, Keynes here was actually complaining about people like me. What I think his big problem was this idea that government intervention was a serious problem and that the government should intervene as little as possible. Keynes was more of a fan of government intervention, but he had to fight against this incredible economic orthodoxy that I'm still kind of part of to get his ideas fixed. But this is, I think, an example of what we're talking about today. This is an incredibly good idea coming out of a guy that I only really agree with intermittently. And it's actually interesting. I can definitely see Keynes's influence on politicians today who don't really know that they're influenced by Keynes. So it's sort of interesting the way that works. So the best example of this dynamic that I'm talking about here, the best example of an economist having a negative influence, and so yeah, this video is not a screed against environmentalists. It may be a screed against economists or the way that we treat the economics profession. So the best example, or rather the worst example, of an economist whose few good ideas were used as an excuse to make all of his bad ideas, to turn all of his bad ideas into a form of holy writ. The best example of that would be Karl Marx, actually. I am not a Marxist. I am not left-leaning, but I can acknowledge that Karl Marx was brilliant. What he did brilliantly was he saw, I think more clearly than anybody else at that point, just how important economics was, just how important economic relations, business, trade, what have you, was as the underpinning of everything in politics and society. I think it's been about 25 years since I've looked at this, but I think he said everything else was just the superstructure, whereas economics were what mattered underneath. And this has been a tremendously influential idea. I think it's right. I mean, it can be overdone, and other elements that can be important tend to be minimized. But I think it's a tremendously powerful intellectual tool and very valuable. There are a lot of people following in the footsteps of that good idea, by the way. If you're like me, a right-leaning person who is tremendously concerned with, I do almost say obsessed with, the idea of economic growth and what it means for development, I'm very much interested in that. You know, and this obsession with sort of GDP, economic growth, this, that, and the other thing. I mean, that describes everybody at the Fox Business Channel. In that sense, we're all Marxists. Now, that was one very, very good idea that Marx had that added a ton to what how we understand things. But he also had an incredible range of terrible ideas. He had this sort of utopian idea about how the world was going to end that added up basically to a religion, sort of a lunatic religion. This sort of all these ideas of how history was going to go from here. He was a decent economist who thought he could be a prophet. And unfortunately, a lot of people took him at his word. And we got a lot of disaster and death and slaughter out of it. So that's probably the best known example of an economist who got out of control. But the one that I want to talk to today is Thomas Malthus. Now, Thomas Malthus was a British, I believe he was sort of a British vicar. He was a British reverend. I think he was a British priest, perhaps. You know what? I don't think any of those terms, as somebody who knows only a little bit about the Reformation, I feel bad about that. He was a religious figure in the end of the 1700s in England. But because of the way things were back there, you could be a religious type figure preaching to a flock and also a scientist. And Thomas Robert Malthus was one such person. Now, he did have one very, very good idea. In 1798, he wrote an essay called On the Principle of Population. And in this essay, Malthus basically founded modern population science. So the idea of looking at population rigorously, factoring in economic factors, just using that data for more than to say, oh, we've listed all the people who were born and died in our church. I'm sure there are other underpinnings of that and sort of Enlightenment thought in France and Britain or whatnot, but he's the guy who drew it all together. He's the guy who essentially invented population science. And that too is tremendously useful to us. And is just part of the mental furniture of anybody, any educated person in the West or in the world that has been influenced by Western thought, sort of political economic thought. Tremendously influential guy, and stuff, if you read an article in The Economist, there's just a bit of Malthus everywhere in it, and not in a bad way. He really did create something useful, this idea of population science, or sort of looking at things. But he also had a really, really terrible idea. And actually, it's more or less the idea that Thanos expressed in Avengers and in Infinity War. What he said was, after looking at these population numbers, bringing them together in an interesting way, he said, well, look, there's a natural rate of there's a natural population level, and it's a real problem that when we get surpluses here in England, those surpluses tend to result in more people being born. That's a real problem because there's sort of a natural level of population that can be supported in this country, and it means that when we go above it, mass death is inevitable. Famine and war, terrible, terrible things. And this is a religious man, which is amazing, saying that, famine and war are terrible things, but they're also natural things. They're just inevitable. That's just the way things happen. And that's the way it's going to be. And that, along with the useful aspects of Malthus's thought, sorry, we have a plane here. Along with the useful aspects of Malthus's thought, that has been incorporated into, like I said, every educated person's sort of mental furniture. This idea of, and it underpins a ton of stuff. Now, I think at this point, it's worth to say this about Thomas Malthus's central idea. He was wrong. He was completely wrong. When he was writing in 1798, there were 1 billion people. And he was essentially arguing that if population got anywhere over that, also, I think, I'm not sure if he was specifically talking about England, but England's population is, I think, at least 10 times bigger than it was in 1800. Maybe not. Yeah, actually, I think that's right. About 10 times bigger. So 1 billion people in 1798. In 2018, we have got near 7 billion people. And unlike the constant famine and war that he said was inevitable, now he didn't just say there would be famine and war. He would say that there would be famine and war until we were back down to that 1 billion level. Now, he has been disproved over and over and over again. We're living now in 2018 with 7 billion people. And despite what the news tells you, famine and war has been almost eradicated. Syria and Yemen, and I guess what's developing in the Congo again, and 4 or 5 other places are horrible. But compared to 1798, the world is essentially at peace and well fed. So Malthus has been completely disproven, but his ideas are all still there. They still underpin so much of what we say and what we think about these issues. It's a zombie idea. This zombie idea, and it's something that like I said, I thought I saw shades of it in reviews and discussion of Avengers: Infinity War online, but it's a sentiment that you can see everywhere if you're looking for it. Just this constant sense that that overpopulation is something that we need to be concerned about. That overpopulation is a serious problem, and it's part of that mental architecture. A lot of it comes forth in now. Nobody would come out and say directly, "Well, gosh, it'd be great if half the world died. Gosh, it'd be great if billions of people were culled." But what they will say very openly in articles is that there need to be less people. There need to be less people. And I actually don't dispute that it would be a good thing if there were less people. Like if we were more sensible about reproduction and this, that, and the other thing. Like that sort of thing I'm fine with. But it shouldn't trend in one less. There are poor countries for which overpopulation has been a very, very real problem. I don't actually see many where it's still a problem today. What's fascinating is watching this like terrible problem of Bangladesh sort of solve itself. It's economic development. But regardless, this zombie idea of Malthus's that we're just, next week it's going to happen. We're all going to, 6 billion people are going to die off, is still present 220 years later. And that's kind of insane. And it's not, sorry. So you see articles talking about this, usually from an environmentalist perspective, but also from right-wing articles that obsess about immigration, this idea of being swamped or this, that, and the other thing. Different swings on the same thing, but it's still Malthus. But what troubles me even more, I've got a couple degrees, been lucky enough to hang out with a lot of other folks with a couple degrees and generally pretty nice jobs or what have you. And it's just interesting going beyond this idea of what you see written on the New York Times opinion page and talking about in a very generic sort of way, just this overpopulation, it's the worst. These sort of things you hear at dinner parties, things you hear at friends' houses, just about how it's this horrible thing that there's so many people in the world and people are a curse or people are terrible, and nobody really thinks through the sort of anti-human subtext to that. The subtext that is, of course, always present is the idea that the sort of educated, well-employed people are always talking about somebody else. It's not a billion people in their developed world that need to disappear. It's the billions of people in the developing world. Because wouldn't it be better if they were sort of put out of their misery? Once again, this is not something that's ever stated, even in private, in dinner parties. But it's that very clear subtext that. It's my people are not the people that are going to be taken away. And that's, of course, ironic, because if you actually do know anything about the way that environmentalism works, it's actually the people in the developed world that are the most costly and the most terrible for these, environmental resources. So yeah, this bothers me deeply. I'm not sure if I'm expressing it well, but it's definitely something that I see online in books. In conversations with people I enjoy, just this sort of sense that it's all going to fall apart, and people are going to start a mass die-off, and that'd be great. And that is wrong. It is, like, as I said, it's a zombie idea. The people in the Republican Party, in the U.S. Congress and beyond, are really wedded to this idea that if you cut taxes, that'll instantly solve everything. Economic growth will go through the roof. America will be great again. It'll be amazing. This has been pretty, I'd say, actually, yes, certainly since the Bush tax cuts, maybe since the Reagan tax cuts. So this is an idea, a zombie idea, that has been disproven pretty comprehensively for 20 years. Malthus's idea that overpopulation, war, and famine are inevitable and something we shouldn't worry about has been a zombie idea for 10 times as long as this sort of tax cut fundamentalism. But it still continues. And the results have been horrifying, pretty much from the get-go. I've been reading a lot about the British Empire right now, and hopefully we'll be publishing a book by the end of the month by the end of May, called Avoiding the British Empire, which tries to learn the lessons of the British Empire and apply them to the US's declining empire. But I'm studying, little plug there, I'm studying the British Empire pretty intensely right now. And one of the, well, two of the greatest horrors that occurred during the British Empire were justified by Thomas Malthus. And he was explicitly used as a source to allow them to happen. I'm referring to the Irish and Indian famines. Sorry, there were multiple Indian famines. I should have the figures and the dates in front of me. I do not. I apologize. But the Irish famine, obviously, because I'm in the United States with a lot of Irish heritage, occupies a bigger piece of mental space in my head, which is unfortunate, but it does. I believe there were multiple Indian famines under British control, and one especially horrific one in the, oh gosh, 1860s, 1870s. I should have that date. But these famines were justified through the use of Malthus. The idea was, well, gosh, there isn't much we can do here. So the people who ran the British Empire, who were responsible at that time for Ireland and India, just assumed that millions, and it was millions of their subjects could starve to death, even while they were exporting food from Ireland, and had all the resources necessary to create subsistence for these people. They argued that it would be crueler, it would be more cruel to help these people, because you know, Thomas Malthus says they were going to die anyway, and this is just a natural effect. There's nothing we can do. It's science. In the 20th century, Malthus's influence has been less horrific, or less blatantly horrific. So far, who knows? When we see the full consequences, maybe we'll have a different opinion. Even in 1900, people in the British Empire could look back. Honestly, actually, even appallingly, even in histories written in the early 21st century, you can still read English historians writing long defenses of what happened in Ireland and India, defenses of those famines. So yeah, that's basically to say, well, you know, who's to say what the influence of 20th century use of Malthus will be? But Malthus is used sort of on the left and the right, or at least is a flavoring for the ideas of people on the left and the right. In the 20th century and the 21st century. There's this idea of overpopulation, and I'm not denying that overpopulation exists as a dynamic, as something to look out for, but this obsession with it, and this obsession with the idea that we're going to run out of everything tomorrow, our environment can't support this. I mean, we have been told by certain groups of environmentalists that the world is going to end 5 years from now. We've been told that for quite a long time. It could be that this time they're right, but we've been told that the world is going to end 5 years from now for 50 years. First, it was agricultural resources. Then it was, I think, certain metals. I can't recall the exact details. Peak oil. It's been peak oil for a very long time. Now that's sort of frittered away. And now it is climate science and carbon. And I believe in climate change. I believe it's man-made, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm a little skeptical when I look at this chaos. I mean, who knows? Maybe this is the time. This time is the time where all those environmentalist boys and girls who cried wolf are actually correct. And, you know, 2 years, this is my last time on a plane. And Puerto Rico, where I'm sitting right now, is going to be drowned. I'd be surprised, frankly. I'd be surprised. But when I look at that panic, that way of looking at things, I see Thomas Malthus. And on the right, there's an obsession with population and how populations are going to swamp other populations. And it's fascinating looking at this. You know, there's this idea. Looking at this and looking at how this zombie idea of a population swamping, I mean, it's subtly different, the way that sort of right-leaning people use these Malthusian ideas, but they're definitely part of it as well. This idea that the classic in the United States is the idea that the Mexicans are swamping us. They're coming for us. They're gonna they're breeding like crazy, and they're gonna come across this border, and they're gonna take over. They're gonna take over the parts of California and Texas we took from them again, and and this relies on this idea, this very Malthusian idea, that people down south of the border are breeding out of control, and we don't have the resources that can handle them. We're gonna run out. Now, when you actually show them the demographics, you actually look at the data of what's happening. Mexican women back in the 60s and 70s were reproducing at a very high level. But now it's pretty much drawn even with the United States. The United States, I believe, is higher, though that kind of, like, I think there's a distinction between folks who are actually born in the States and then immigrants, whatever. But the point is, this place, Latin America and all the countries south of the border that were supposed to be this source of this endless drive of population that was going to swamp us and change everything, now has kids at about the rate of 40-something hipsters working on YouTube channels instead of anyway. So yeah, that is something else that's not true. And now, of course, now that it's becoming very clear, even to figures on the right, that this whole Mexican fear thing is diminishing. Now people are focused on Muslims and this idea that the particularly laughable idea that Muslims are going to swamp the United States in a similar way, and the less ridiculous but still ridiculous idea that they're going to swamp Europe, because you actually look at the details on that, and more recently, in the past 10 years, for most Muslim countries, the rate of reproduction or fertility rate, I'm no doubt massacring the terminology here, has basically fallen to the level of Europe. So that problem is another thing that has disappeared. But if you actually go to somebody who believes in these ideas and present this data to them, they'll deny it's true. And that too is Thomas Malthus. It is crazy. And this is sort of a sad story. The persistence of this idea, of this sort of crazy way of looking at population and overpopulation and this, that, and the other thing. But what is a happy story is what has actually happened, and the ability of the world and scientists or whatnot to keep coming up with better solutions that make this Malthusian dream, this Malthusian dystopia, not happen. Because if in 2018 we were still working with the agricultural, scientific, and energy resources that we had in 1798, then yes, Malthus would have been absolutely right. There would have been mass die-offs by the 1810s, for sure. But that's not what happened. Things just keep sort of getting better and better and better and better. And there is a role for panic about this sort of stuff. There is a role for these Malthusian panics. I do think that as much fun as I've made of those sort of chicken littles, of those girls and boys who cried wolf in the environmental field in this video, I do believe that they've actually been very useful, because it's that panic, unfortunately, that is the only thing that drives political progress. I think that the Clean Air Act is a fantastic thing. I think the fact that acid rain and ozone holes are gone and no longer an issue is a really fantastic thing. And I think that this panic will end up doing work within the next 30, 40 years to solve this carbon climate issue. But I think a little bit more highly of the people viewing this content, the people who tune into this channel. And I thought you might be interested in hearing about one of the underpinnings of sort of this thought on the left and right that's just wrong, that's just kind of crazy. And it's a good reminder that so much of what we talk about, so much of the assumptions that go into this channel, even though I'm constantly trying to be self-critical, I'm probably doing and saying a lot of things that are just nuts because of assumptions that I'm making or books that I've read a while ago that I don't even see. So I guess this video is a big case for skepticism, and I think that you folks who tune in here are definitely skeptical types who aim for thinking a little more freely. So I think that pretty much, I think I've made my way through my outline, and I have covered everything that I wanted to cover. What do we got for questions? What do you guys want to talk about? India is making thorium reactors. Cool. What would you guys like to discuss? I'm gonna scale up here in these comments, see if I can find some questions. I'm impressed with these comments. I'm impressed with these comments. I think we've got a lot of people actually talking about the subject that I discussed. That's rare. That's good. That makes me think that Thomas Malthus is relevant today, and I was right to bring up. I would like to point out that I'm on sort of as close as I get to a vacation today. So if you want to ask me a bunch of questions on what happened in Syria, Russia, this, that, and the other thing this week, I'm not going to be able to answer adequately. I'd prefer it if with these initial questions, we try to focus on the topic of this video rather than other things, but we'll discuss anything. And yeah, Logo Cool Extreme, the first question that's come over the transom is, how's Puerto Rico holding up? And my quick answer would be not well. It is kind of depressing. I may or may not do a video on it. Got a couple other balls in the air, but yeah, Puerto Rico is a mess. It's a beautiful place. You should come visit. It's amazing. The food is extraordinary. The beaches. I've been here for 4 days. I haven't been to a beach yet. I probably won't go. I'm kind of an indoor kid. But the museums are great. Old San Juan is a treasure. It's fantastic. But man, you can just see. We got a sort of cheap Airbnb that's sort of across the street from all the really nice hotels. But the way that we're in a very touristy, very nice hotel-y neighborhood, and you can have really nice hotels, like sort of top-of-the-line hotels, next to very serviceable but kind of cheap Airbnb stuff. And I'm looking across out of the window now at a vacant high-rise, like a vacant high-rise hotel. It's a mess. It is a mess. And PR is an American territory. These people are Americans. How is this still happening in 2018? And actually, this mess is, I believe, the fault of the U.S. government and the fault of certain issues. But it's not about the hurricane, really. I think we've heard a lot about Puerto Rico's neglect after the hurricane of last year because Trump is president. I don't think it would have been much different if Obama had been president. We just would have heard less about it. The problems that I'm referring to with my time in Puerto Rico, it's not necessarily, it's not horror. I don't think people are starving in the streets. I haven't been out to the countryside yet, which I've been told is worse. But there's just no money here. The place is suffering seriously. They had industry that was sort of put together by so U.S. incentive structure that was taken away in the 90s, and that economy just sort of ran away. And also their debt creation was incentivized because people just assumed that Puerto Rico would always be able to pay, and now it's becoming clear that they're not. So money has just dried up. It's a rough place. I don't mean that it's rough in that I've seen any kind of disaster or hardship or whatnot. Puerto Rico is interesting. People are asking why there isn't more unrest or craziness. There's an outlet. Like Europe in the 19th century, they'd put any radical, anybody who was super dissatisfied, rather than joining a radical movement, they just sail off to the United States. That's exactly what Puerto Rico has. I've heard estimates that as many as 1 million people have left since last fall, since the hurricane last fall. I don't think that's true. That can't be true. But people who can't get a job just go to the United States. So there's that Puerto Rico has going for it. But it's very sad walking around, say, both Old San Juan and sort of the San Juan downtown, and getting a sense of just how far this place has fallen. It's very sad, but it's also an incredible place to visit. You should visit. You should bring them their tourist dollars, which is why my brother and I decided to have his kind of nerdy bachelor party here. Come. Last night there was, we just amazing scene last night with music and dancing and fun people out in the streets. And the streets may have had a lot of potholes, and we're going way beyond potholes here. There are legit holes in sidewalks that people have just decided to build a garden in because there's nobody to fix it. But you have that sort of weird mix of incredible beaches, incredible museums, this, that, and the other thing, vaguely post-apocalyptic municipal environment, and lovely, lovely people having a great time. So that's what I think about Puerto Rico. Burton Stacy III says, wow, brain drain. And oh boy, yes, it does. Yes, that's true. Yes, that is true. And it's very, very sad for Puerto Rico. Stefan asks a good question. How high does the human population have to be a real problem? As I just said, if we had had the same range of technologies, economic development, this, that, and the other thing that Malthus was talking about in 1798, human population would have been a real problem by 1810, about 10 years later. There's a very real, if you chose to look at it this way, there's a very real, not quite real time, but our productive capacities, not through big breakthroughs, but through sort of iterative small things, increase just above world population, and have been doing so since Malthus. Of course, choosing to see it that way could be a very Malthusian way to look at it as well, so who knows. But you can tell the story in that way. I do think that demographers will tell you that it's not a question of when is too much or how high the human population have to be. We know how high the human population is going to be, and then it's going to start falling. I think it's projected around 2050. We're going to reach a total of 10 billion, which is hard to imagine, 3 billion more people. 10 billion, and then the population is going to start to fall. And what's exciting is it'd be interesting to see if our sort of innovation manages to continue beyond that, life get more interesting, conceivably. So overpopulation is a problem if you're a poor country. If you don't have the basic resources to put basic things in place and take advantage of the sort of technological innovation. And we're not talking about, we're not talking about digits here on the computer. We're talking about extraordinary stuff like the Green Revolution that proved that India could be fed completely in the 1960s and 70s. It's primarily agricultural stuff. I believe, I'd like there to be hundreds of billions of people, but on other planets. I do think that the Earth has a sort of maximum beyond which we should not go. And I kind of like the idea of a lot of sort of large swaths of rural interior being given back to nature because people generally want to live in cities now. But I definitely think we can go a lot higher in terms of population without too much trouble, but also that it's not a problem because we already know this cap. We just have to proportionally in percentage terms deal with a little more growth, and then we're going to start falling. More questions. Let's see. Is it because of their crazy bureaucracy? Oh, you see, no. Okay, Burton States 3 talking about Puerto Rico predominantly. Is it because of their crazy bureaucracy that there's a lot of this sort of instinct to blame Puerto Rico? It's not like Puerto Rico's bureaucratic or there's some Latin approach. No, that's utter hogwash. If you think that having a lot of Puerto Ricans or sort of a Latin influence is bad for a city, I'd urge you to check out Miami or New York City. That's insane. Not saying that that's what Burton Stacy III said. I'm just saying it seems similar to some other arguments I've seen. The real problem with Puerto Rico is it was built up by a range of U.S. government incentives to try and squash advocacy for Puerto Rican independence in the 1960s and 1970s. And then when that movement dissipated, the U.S. Congress was like, fuck them, and took away all those incentives. So a Puerto Rican economy that was sort of based on pharma manufacturing and some other things, because of all those incentives that were given, was just taken away and ripped out from them by Clinton and the Republican Congress in 1996. And that sort of phased out between 96 and 2006, and almost all the big companies left. It's really kind of sort of a shameful episode for those companies, frankly, that they just left as soon. And sure, it's a rational economic choice or whatever, but it's kind of a bad look. And the other thing that is actually probably more important, I remember this vaguely from my couple of years as a kind of a stockbroker around the turn of the century. Not 100% on this. Should have, if I were doing a Puerto Rico video, I would have looked into it. But the municipal bonds of Puerto Rico, the debt that Puerto Rico issues, has a special treatment. They're called tax-free munis. I don't recall exactly how this works, but my understanding is that investors, this is another incentive that was given. I don't know if it dates back to the 60s or 70s or 1900. I'm not sure. But the debt of Puerto Rico for U.S. investors is tax-free. So retail investors, institutional investors, banks that buy Puerto Rican debt don't have to pay tax on the interest that they make. That's huge. That's a very, very big thing for any investor that has made Puerto Rican debt tremendously attractive. And that means that for decades, for however long this incentive was in place, and I believe it's still in place, Puerto Rico was able to borrow vastly more than it needed. And while they had this vibrant manufacturing economy, this could sort of, limp along, and it wasn't too problematic because, they could sell their debt for less than most because investors weren't paying taxes on the interest. So yippee. Now, when their economy disappeared, as it did between 1996 and 2006, debt was still really easy to get into. And I am sure the people in Puerto Rico seem very convinced that a lot of this was stolen. They don't believe it's been adequately audited. All this money, they don't quite understand how their country or their territory of country, nation, whatever, of 3.5 million people owes $73 billion. Walking around Old San Juan, you can see just truly like gorgeous, beautiful public works projects, sort of beautification stuff. And you sort of look around and you're like, wait, why does this? I mean, it's something you'd see, plazas that you'd see in European capitals. And you realize that stuff was built by debt financed. So this idea that the Puerto Ricans have done something wrong, like maybe, it would have been nice if they had elected better people to lead them. But I look at the U.S. Congress today, and I certainly don't feel any superiority. We're doing the exact same thing. Having massive, except instead of beautiful tourist plazas that actually last, we're building, little mini empires in the desert that are going to evaporate as soon as the debt gets called in, which is going to be sooner than everybody in Washington, D.C. assumes. So yeah, Puerto Rico is actually a cautionary tale. It's not different and worse than the United States. It's where the United States is heading because of out-of-control debt. So yeah, there's that. What are your thoughts on Pompeo becoming Secretary of State? Wow. Mike Pompeo. Haven't done in depth, but what I do know about his connections to Islamophobes and just belligerent morons generally, I would absolutely be against it. But what I think about it, like I think Pompeo, for me, I think it's a question of like degrees of negativity. I mean, I find the views expressed on Islam, Iran, and the sort of Saudi Arabia and the Middle East region of almost everybody in Washington, D.C. deeply objectionable. Pompeo is next level. I can't I can't speak to it in detail. I haven't looked into it in detail, but if I recall correctly from looking at Pompeo a year ago, did not like the guy, and found him problematic and really, really, really unpleasant. It is interesting. So what to think, like, what exactly this is going to look like, the Trump administration, where all the people, well, except for Mattis, God bless Jim Mattis, our Secretary of Defense. Nobody looking to Theranos because we need him to stay there. Now that Tillerson is gone and McMaster is gone, and we've got people like John Bolton, who is legitimately terrifying. I have done the research on that. He's actually deeply affiliated with things like the Gatestone Institute, which is like a rabidly anti-Muslim organization and like a disgusting place. And it's like, Bolton really bothers me. Pompeo, I think, is probably slightly more careful about his affiliations than Bolton was. So, but anyway, it's going to be interesting to see like what Trump Unleashed looks like. I think we might actually, I'm hoping we might actually see some sort of fiscal constraints here. Like if Bolton and Pompeo and Trump sitting together in a room got to do exactly what they wanted, they could have, I mean, we'd have troops on the ground outside Tehran right now. But I think these folks just sort of look at the legitimate cost of what has happened in Iraq and Syria and whatnot. And they're like, look, we can't. I mean, yeah, maybe we can do this for 6 months, but we can't do this in Iran, a country 3 times bigger than Iraq, much better defended, better terrain. Yeah, we can't do this for more than 6 months. Why in God's name would we try to do that? So it could very well be that with this nightmare cabinet, Trump and the people in the military are finding themselves constrained. They just can't do these stupid things they've been talking about for so long. That's my very optimistic approach. That could be wrong. More questions. Email Gishhaidinus says that I like Caspian Report a lot too. Always a plug for Caspian Report. Love those videos. They're really helpful. Okay, I need to answer questions. Okay. Was the Turkey coup staged? Because it looks like, unless there's dramatic new evidence that has come out, and this is the 2016? Yeah, 2016. 2 weeks after I left the country. There was a coup in Turkey in 2016 that has allowed Erdogan, the former prime minister, now president, to go on a 2-year-long purge, and I think pretty sure that the country is still being governed under a sort of emergency status. It's been pretty nightmarish. Now, was the Turkey coup staged? Unless dramatic new evidence has come out this week while I've been in Puerto Rico, not going to beaches, no. My answer is no. I knew and had conversations with the journalists around. I knew and had conversations with the journalists living in Turkey at the time, and they saw no evidence of U.S. involvement, this, that, and the other thing. You can, believe the wacky internet over the journalists on the ground, but I don't. I don't believe. What I do believe is possible is that Erdogan knew that the coup was coming and had the opportunity to stop elements of it with less loss of life and whatnot, but saw immediately that how valuable this coup would be to him. So if you're talking about the coup being staged in that sense and that Erdogan could have stopped it and didn't, then yeah, actually I do believe that's possible, which is really sad, a little horrifying. But this idea that it was all sort of cooked up by the AKP party, no, that's frankly, that's bullshit. And no, I don't believe that. I don't believe that to be the case. Questions. What if Shivansh 2018 Notial today? That's a very interesting question. What if the Middle East was not carved like today? We had experience for hundreds of years. I mean, the Middle East was largely, I don't want to overstate this, but was largely run by the Ottoman Empire for about 400 or 500 years. And that was sorry, I'm doing a little hit thing here. That was very different. I can't. I mean, I love counterfactuals. I love trying to piece together what the world would look like if things were subtly different. That's a really fun thing to do. But man, that's such a big one that I can't even begin to answer it, wrap my head around it. It's determined so much. Those sort of Europe imposed dividing lines, the Middle East, have impacted everything that's happened in the 20th century so much. It's really hard to point to. Honestly, I'm not someone who's like, oh, it's these borders. People just sort of have spend too much time talking about these borders. It's not so much the borders. It's the folks that have been encouraged within those borders that are so problematic. As I pointed out elsewhere, Saudi Arabia was founded by the British Empire and has been sustained by the United States. That is the central problem of the Middle East today, and has been the central problem in the Middle East for the past half century. So if Saudi Arabia has been used to derail any figure that promised real independence from the United States and sort of general imperial approach. Nasser in the 50s was, I guess, more towards the late 50s, 60s, was bogged down in ruinous proxy wars against the Saudis. And of course, after that, they could just get weirder and weirder. Saddam Hussein is not someone to make a case for, but he was sort of an Arab nationalist who wanted independence for the Arab world. After this stuff got crushed over and over again by the Saudis. Actually, the Saudis were sort of the main instrument in that. So yeah, I think it's less about the borders than it is about the people whose leadership have been imposed on those countries within those borders. So more questions. What will Bolton's reaction to reaction to the news on the Koreas be? Asks Aristarchus. Stefan says lol, LOL right after that. And actually, honestly, I think that's most probably going to be Bolton's reaction to the news out of the Koreas. I have not looked at this issue in detail. I have long ignored the issue of North Korea because I thought it was a complete waste of time. I think that we see blow-ups between North Korea and South Korea. The U.S. every new U.S. president, Korean leadership that chooses to test that U.S. president. It's a big deal. Everybody panics. The only other thing other than Trump they mentioned on CNN, and it's essentially pointless. Nothing really changes. There's sort of this, that, and the other thing. This week, I've been wondering if I should revise that approach. I've been wondering if I should maybe take a deeper dive and take a look at it, because some of this stuff looks hopeful. But then there was another tweet that I saw last night that compared that amazing picture of Kim Jong-un and forgive me, I have a guess, but I'm not going to massacre it. The new president or prime minister of South Korea. There's that beautiful picture of the North Korean and South Korean leaders shaking hands, and it's gorgeous. And this tweet was like, okay, that's 2000, that's 2018. Here's 2007, and here's 1990. It's the exact same. It's not Kim Jong-un, it's Kim Jong-il, and it's a beautiful, heartwarming picture of the North and South Korean leaders shaking hands and announcing a new era. So I am deeply, deeply skeptical. There are things that have been mentioned that sounded more interesting, yeah, I think Bolton's reaction to this right now, the developments thus far, are kind of similar to mine. Wherein that I'm just sort of like, I don't really think this is going to change anything. I really don't. One way that it could change things, because what is different from 1999 and 2007, once again, this comes from directly from a very perceptive Twitter thread that I did retweet at Robo Law. It was not my own thinking. Twitter at RaboLaw, where you can see a really great thread on what North Korea means and what this Korean thing means. And what the thread makes the argument is actually this time it could be different. It could be different because every actor involved, from Japan to China to both the Koreas, is realizing that it's time to start factoring the United States out of this, because the United States has demonstrated itself to be such a child on this issue. If the United States is going to be run by someone like Donald Trump, it can no longer be trusted to deal with what is quite literally an existential issue for South Korea and North Korea. So that is what's different this time. That the United States, I would argue that the United States has always been somewhat childish in its approach to the region, but it is now loudly, obviously having no idea what it's doing. And I think that is scaring a lot of people in Asia and is encouraging them to handle it themselves, which isn't the worst thing, I'll be honest. Yeah, I don't think there's a real reason for us to have, was it 25 or 35,000 U.S. soldiers hanging out there to be sacrificed. I don't think that's useful or helpful to us. So we got all the bases we need in Asia. So I'm actually, if this moves forward, I'd be perfectly happy to see that, but I would be surprised if it did, frankly. Okay, that's Korea. Yes, Shivansh to 2018 and Natiel asks, Gaza and Palestine is running horribly low on water. Why no new on that topic? I think I've mentioned elsewhere many times that Israel, Gaza, Palestine, it's all, it's sort of a difficult topic for me. I'm honestly kind of conflicted. I'm an American, so as a U.S. citizen, we were talking earlier about sort of mental underpinnings we're not aware of. A mental underpinning of my own that I'm aware of is that I'm pretty much, I am no longer an uncritical Zionist, but Zionism is what I was raised with, and I still believe a lot of those things. I believe that after the horrors that have been committed against the Jewish people, they deserve a homeland. I believe that in a lot of ways, the sort of the story of the Jewish people is one of the greatest stories ever told. It's fascinating stuff, and yeah, some of that's definitely part of my upbringing, and but it's still things that I believe. At the same time, I now, having lived in the Muslim world for 6 years, I have a very, very different perspective on what's happening there, and it's clashing within. I'm confused myself. I just read last night a really in-depth article on exactly what you're talking about. Just what a horror show Gaza is right now. It's not just the water that's running low. It's the complete control by people that hates it. Gazans can't travel. Gazans can't do anything without the permission of the Israeli state. And at some point, I'm going to have to reckon with the clash between what I believe and what is happening. And I thought that I was going to have to do it when that peaceful protest was slaughtered by the Israelis a couple of weeks back. But it does seem like people have backed off for a bit. So yeah, the next Gaza war, and there will be another Gaza war, I'll have to weigh in on Israel, but I just don't. I just need to figure that out, and that's not my main research focus at the moment, which is the British Empire, which obviously, of course, the British Empire has a tremendous amount to do with creating the problems of Israel and Palestine, as with essentially everything else in the world. Logger Cool Extreme asks, can America's debt be fixed? Yes, it can. It can be fixed. It will be fixed. How that is fixed is the question. Will we inflate out of it? Will we default? Will we pay it? Possibly. The markets all still seem to think we're going to pay it. And yes, America's debt absolutely fixed. There is a complete unwillingness to make basic decisions. I believe if you just did we don't need European taxation levels to solve the debt. I haven't done the math myself. Maybe this is the Congressional Budget Office has data on this. But if we kicked up income taxes across the board 5%, done. I think that pretty much that'd pretty much do the job, or at least put things on a much more sustainable footing. And the national debt is not something that's ever going to be completely wiped out. I think maintaining a debt actually does make sense. You know, it's bonds and whatnot. In periods of economic decline, I have become a Keynesian as well. In periods of economic decline, it makes sense for there to be stimulus, for the government to step in and sort of pump a little money in. What makes no economic sense, and what we've got right now, is vast economic stimulus in a time of economic upswing. That's insane. And that's what is currently putting up our debt by about $1 trillion a year. So there will always be a national debt, but the current level of growth is completely unsustainable. The Washington Post reported that by 2022, the debt service, like paying the interest on all the debt we owe, is going to cost, if not more than, almost as much as the entire U.S. Defense Department. So our debt service is about to cost as much as the Defense Department. That needs to end. The national debt, you know, I don't know, it's at $23 trillion right now. Honestly, if it were at 18 and having on a downward trajectory, we'd be in dramatically better shape. And, you know, we can do that very easily with like a 5% income tax rise. But the political will to do that is non-existent. So yeah, can be easily handled. Wow, that's pretty ugly sentiment there, Ali Loaheim. Let's see. Questions. Wow. Shivansh, 2018 Nautial. Rohingyas was involved in 5 to 6 almost terrorist attacks and 1 successful attack in India. Is discussing on sending them back. Is it the right decision? No, it is not the right decision to send the Rohingya back to Burma, where they are being slaughtered and ethnically cleansed. Yeah, the Rohingya are fascinating issue. Honestly, I find that they are, when I think about the Rohingya, and after I get back from some weddings in Turkey, I might actually finally make this video. The Rohingya, to me, seem most like the Armenians, actually. This is almost, except less so. When people in Turkey justify what happened to the Armenians, they talk about how there were rebel groups. There were people who were fighting against the Turkish government. So it's okay that 1 million people died. So that's exactly the way. Interestingly, I'm not saying this is what you are, Shivansh, but this is the way a lot of people in the U.S. who are, you know, anti-Muslim talk about the Rohingya. You know, even though these are people who would freak out, constantly screaming Armenian genocide from the rooftops, want to take the exact same attitude towards the Rohingya that the Ottomans took to the Armenians. And this attitude is that because there's 1 or 2 people doing stupid stuff, we can kill 1 million people. Or I know the numbers are different than that, but because there's a couple militant groups, we can shunt off a whole bunch of people to go die en masse. I think that's insane and amoral, and that's the same sort of argument there. No, I do not think that the Rohingya should be sent back to die in Burma in their hundreds of thousands because some dipshits tried to carry out some terrorist attacks. I think that's crazy. Our visits of the U.S. ambassador in Athens to wow, this is specific, Aristides Lycus. Our visits to the U.S. ambassador in Athens to various Greek military institutions, part of a plan to eventually close the Suez Canal and help Saudi Arabia by bringing the price of oil above $100. No. That is not the case, for sure. I don't understand why they would use Greece to do that. If there were some plot to shut down the Suez crisis, it'd be very straightforward to use some of the jihadi militants we have connections to in Egypt. That's pretty straightforward. Well, I don't understand what Greece would have to do with that at all. Yeah, and no, I don't think the U.S. would shut down the Suez Canal for any reason. We are still a tremendous international trader, and a lot of our international trade goes through the Suez Canal. This strikes me as kind of coming out of the realm of a bad conspiracy theory rather than good conspiracy theory. Almost, I've been reading a lot about this recently, sort of looking at history of U.S. empire. All the horrors that the U.S. empire has done, has committed, have been in the name of commercial realities. The coup in Guatemala was all about United Fruit. The coup in Iran that created most of the issues of the modern Middle East was about the British. I think it's what eventually became British Petroleum, but was about the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company and U.S. investment in that. So it's always about commercial realities and not allowing folks to nationalize stuff and stop the flow of money. So if you hear about a nefarious thing that the U.S. or the CIA is planning that is against against economic concerns, that would have an effect that would be bad for trade or markets, you can pretty much assume it's hogwash. It's not a nefarious plot; it's an explicit plot by a moron who's sitting in the president, the Oval Office right now. If U.S. empire and the British Empire before it is all about opening markets. They're not going to, crush things. Unless they're competitors, of course. But the Suez Canal, like the Panama Canal, is something that closing that would create tremendous damage to U.S. interests. So, heck no, that's not coming. More questions? Have we got more questions? I don't know what that means. Can America's debt be fixed? Thoughts on Mexican elections? No, Stefan. This is one that for years I've wanted to do more coverage of Latin America on the channel, and I just haven't had the time to do the reading. Recently, I listened to an amazing podcast series. I believe it's Mike Duncan's Revolutions, where he just goes through revolutions from history, and he did. Actually, wasn't Mexico. I think he's leaving that out for a discussion of the Mexican Revolution at some point years in the future. But he discussed the revolution in Venezuela and Peru and Argentina to a lesser degree, and it was amazing stuff. The history down there is fascinating, and I really want to dive into it. But yeah, I don't even really follow the contemporary politics. Maybe I'll read the section of The Economist occasionally, but I can't speak to the Mexican elections, which is embarrassing because they're our most important and closest ally. So my sense is that the Mexicans are quite understandably there's a potential for them voting for a sort of unpleasant nationalist character, which is what we did, and how we'd expect anything different after 3 years of a candidate and now president that calls Mexicans rapists. I don't know. But I can't. That's just vague impression. I can't dive in on that at all. Sorry. Do we have more questions? Fathel, is it Fatel or Fathel? Fatel Gueda asks, what's your thoughts on China's expansive policies in the South China Sea? Honestly, I think those are a reaction. I think that if you look at the Obama policy of the pivot to Asia and what he was putting together and doing for his entire administration, I think it was quite bruising for the Chinese leadership. And I think the South China Sea Islands are a desperate attempt to sort of save face. The pivot to Asia is something that I guess at this point, well, no, it's still relevant. Something I should have made videos about was this tremendously sweeping set of programs that just didn't even register in the U.S. press that much. There's this sort of idea that Obama was sort of a step back, a super easy foreign policy guy is hogwash, and I've talked about that a lot. But for some reason, the pivot to Asia isn't something anybody thinks about. And from the U.S. perspective, and even if you just list them off, they don't sound like they're particularly offensive things. Who could be against that sort of thing? But if you look at it from the Chinese perspective, it's like, whoa. In a couple short years in the Obama administration, we opened military bases in Australia, so like militarized that to a new degree, started arming Vietnam, or at least put all the legislative stuff in place. I'm not sure how many shipments have gone through yet. And most extraordinarily, Burma or Myanmar, I don't know, nobody can tell me which one's the appropriate one, went from a pretty safe Chinese client state to a U.S. client state. I mean, that's like, that would be like China suddenly carving off Guatemala or Mexico or something. I mean, that's kind of crazy. It's a country on the border of China. And yes, it was great that this junta or this military government became less powerful and it became sort of more democratic. That's fantastic. Wasn't so great for the Rohingya, but that's great. But what we didn't really reckon with is like, okay, so we just carved off a Chinese client. I mean, that's crazy. And also, then you've also got to consider the TPP, which was a massive trade deal essentially aimed at China's life's blood that was being put together. So I think the South China Sea was sort of a desperate reaction to try and look like they had any sort of self-respect. Yeah, that stuff is pitched in the U.S. like some crazy thing that crazy China has been doing. When you actually look at it in the context of everything else that was happening during the Obama administration, I kind of think it's a sort of a desperate attempt to save face, is what those islands in the South China Sea are. So yeah. Let's see. Will Russia, Siobhan's 2018 Nautiel asks, will Russia bounce back from economic degradation? My answer is maybe, but well, it depends on what you mean there. Russia still has the human capital necessary to have a much more high-functioning, worthwhile economy beyond its petrostate sort of status. But they're not going to get there under current leadership or current approaches. And I, as someone who's more afraid of Russian dissolution than I am Russian aggression, I actually kind of don't want rapid dramatic changes in Russia, which is actually a little crappy of me now that I think about it. But yeah, I don't see China. I don't see Russia rocketing out of the hole it's in anytime soon. Also, it's worth pointing out, if you look at like the economic history of Russia under Putin, I think GDP per capita has like doubled. His use of the petro stuff, what isn't fully appreciated, what's happened since 2014 is sort of an economic degradation and collapse. And in what was happening behind the scenes of all the rosy piles of cash being thrown everywhere, was sort of corruption and enfeebling of the Russian economy and ability to innovate and this, that, and the other thing under petrostate status throughout the Putin years. But the average Russian has seen their standard of living go up. It's now plummeted since 2014, but that is worth remembering. It's not. Putin did a lot to make Russia a place much more worth living before his policies sort of boomerang back. So, What do you think about Iran's missile program? Do you think they will stop it? I don't think so, asked John Butter. Why in God's name would we want Iran to stop its missile program? We absolutely want and have a right to insist, because of its signing of the non-proliferation treaty, that Iran not have nuclear weapons. But the idea that Iran can't have missiles is something that really pisses me off. The idea that because we signed a nuclear deal that's very limited and very carefully crafted to approach this certain issue, the Trump administration is now assuming that they can whine about missile programs, and that is fucking absurd. Iran is a country, I do not like Iran's theocratic regime. I think it has serious problems. I think it's a real issue. But Iran is a country that has been ceaselessly attacked by the United States and its allies for most of 40 years. And it is extraordinary that Iran was willing to come to the table to discuss things in a peaceful fashion with this nuclear deal. This idea that because this nuclear deal was signed, and the U.S. has been dragging ass on actually, if not dealing with like the technical aspects of some of the deal, has been dragging ass on sort of the spirit of the deal. The idea that, okay, we're going to, U.S. banking is going to stop being such a pain in the ass. We're going to help get things flowing again. The U.S. has been definitely, so you can make a case that maybe, okay, the missile program is kind of within the spirit of the deal, which is wrong, but you can make that argument. But you can definitely say that U.S. opening and allowing Iran to come back into the community of nations is also definitely not part of, but is the spirit of the Iran nuclear deal. And the Trump administration has been backing off on that completely. So this idea that this country that has been continuously assaulted by the Iran-Iraq war that the U.S. did a lot to make happen in the 80s, by everything, the axis of evil speech. George Bush essentially declared war on Iran in 2002. We occupied Iraq and Afghanistan, the countries to Iran's east and west, while also continuing to illustrate, to put out really belligerent language about Iran and use billions of CIA and Gulfi dollars to crush the Assad regime in Syria. We have done all of this, and we're supposed to tell Iran that it can't have missiles to defend itself? That's insane. That's absurd. That's yeah. So no, sorry, that it is not something that I find at all compelling. The idea that we have any business telling Iran what it can do with missiles. I think it would be great if Iran decided that they'd be better served by devoting missiles, devoting money to something other than missile research. But the fact that the countries to their east and west are still occupied by the United States, that takes every opportunity to say how much it hates them. It's absurd to me that we're trying to talk about them having missiles as a problem. Kyle Page asks, speaking of Obama-era missteps, what are your thoughts on the U.S.'s intervention in Libya back in 2011? I actually just have a video on the, I can point you directly to a video I made 2 weeks ago. It's called Obama's Noble Failure. I'm not talking about Libya. I'm calling the Iran deal Obama's noble failure. Libya was an unmitigated disaster and was actually dramatically worse than what we're told. The suffering of the Libyan people is horrific, but its implications for geopolitics and the UN Security Council have been disastrous and completely the fault of the United States and its NATO allies. But the NATO allies are a fig leaf. Those are vassals more than anything else. Yeah, I'm very against Libya. You can watch my video on Obama's entire foreign policy legacy by clicking on this little More Freedom Foundation under the window thing and clicking on videos, and you can see there's a picture of Obama with a world, with a globe, and that covers Libya in detail. What do you think about Bernie Sanders' plan to guarantee jobs for all Americans? Yeah, I've been seeing a ton of stuff about job guarantee on Twitter. I haven't read a single article about it. Like I said, I'm kind of on vacation here. So from the name itself and from the fact that Bernie Sanders is pushing it, I can probably say I'm against it. But I don't know anything about it. So, what will USA and Israel do if Russia places nuclear missiles in Syria? I don't know. Who cares? I think that's. I don't think Russia's that stupid. First off, I don't think that's a plausible thing that would happen. It's you can send a nuke from Russia to the United States a lot quicker from what did Sarah Palin say? You know, she can see it from her front yard from Russia a lot quicker than you can send it from Syria. So why would we be interested? Why would Russia be insane enough to put Syria in a position where it had a nuclear weapon? Yeah, I don't think that's going to happen, and I don't think it's something to worry about if it did happen. But it's not. I don't think it's something I can't see any way it would happen. So I'm not going to worry about it. Logo Cool Extreme asks why you be hating on the burn. You know, Bernie Sanders is not somebody I hate. I think he's unlike I don't know, everybody in U.S. politics. He seems to sincerely believe in what he's pitching, but I don't believe in what he's pitching. I don't. Politics is not about appealing personalities for me, nor should it be for anybody. It's about what can work, and I don't think Bernie Sanders' approach can work. I think he is useful, actually. Maybe actually the success of Bernie Sanders could be very useful in the sense of like similar to like Eugene Debs back around the turn of the 19th to 20th century. This guy who ran as a socialist, the Socialist Party of the United States, and got as many as, I think, he topped 5 or maybe even 10. No, probably not 10% at one point. But there was a Socialist Party of the United States back in the early 1900s that got as much as 5 to 10% of the popular vote for president a couple times. And he was tremendously useful in the progressive movement, in creating the progressive movement, not because he was a leader in it, the progressive movement featuring folks as diverse as Woodrow Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt, imperialists all. He was not a part of the progressive movement, but he inspired the progressive movement because the people running the United States were scared. So I think Bernie Sanders and things like the jobs guarantee, once again, I know nothing about it yet, I think are probably useful things to threaten the folks in charge with. So maybe they get off their ass and solve some of these issues that we have. But yeah, I don't really think, I'm not a big fan of Bernie. Logo Cool Extreme asks, it works for Germany and France. Why not the U.S.? Germany and France, as all of Western Europe, are not the United States. This should be obvious. And while I think there are elements of its sort of social democratic model that are super, super interesting, and things of their government model, they operate in a very different world from the United States. They don't have to defend themselves. They don't have to run the world, really. So, yeah, I think a lot of the things that make sense for them don't necessarily make sense for us. And once again, I don't know what the job guarantee is. I haven't read anything about it, and can't speak to it. But yeah, this sort of idea that models that work in Europe can just be automatically exported to the United States, I think, is oversold. But it could be undersold as well. Yeah, that's a very big question that I haven't been boning up on recently. But I do think that I have a general sense that people assume too quickly that what is done in Europe can just be exported wholesale to the United States. I'm not saying, I mean, I think that there are definitely elements of the European healthcare model that should be exported to the United States, because healthcare in the United States is a freaking disaster. It's the best in the world if you can afford it, but if you can't, you're screwed. Anyway, let's see. Logical Extreme asks, is Europe doomed to crisis? I don't think anybody is doomed to anything. I'm an optimist. But Europe's current setup is hard for me to be optimistic about. I think that there's this sense now that, whew, we made it through that terrible decade with everything going wrong. Economics, refugees, nationalists, crazy. And because the European economies have started ticking up a bit, everybody, the urgency to change and improve things is fading away, and everyone's like, woohoo, we made it. And I think that's kind of nuts. I think that people should be using this opportunity to reformulate the EU and fix it. And I don't see that will there. So without that will, I do think Europe is likely to end up with crisis. It could all get better. It could all be averted. It could be fine. But yeah, I'm not super optimistic. So doomed is strong, but I think Logo Cool Extreme's instinct is correct that Europe is going to have some trouble. Moy Mohi asks, what was the Trump role in the peace talk between North Korea and South Korea? Honestly, I don't think it was very high, other than to scare the bejesus out of the South Korean leader and convince him that if he didn't do something, Trump was going to get his capital city bombed to smithereens. So, yeah, I don't think the idea of Trump as a deal maker or somehow useful in this process, I think, is overstated. But I could be wrong about that. Like I said, I don't really believe anything is going to change with the Koreas, so I don't follow the issue too closely. So, Logo Cool Extreme asks, why is a remilitarized Germany a threat to Europe? Germany are very nice people. Who cares if they have a strong military? It's not 1938 anymore. I agree with that to a degree. But I do think that there are sort of... I do think that there are sort of deep historical dynamics at play here. I think Margaret Thatcher was super against the reunification of Germany because she feared exactly this, the return to German power. And it's not, I don't believe that there's some fundamental weakness in German psychology or some like proclivity for evil or something like that. I think that's ridiculous. But if you look at the way that power competition has always worked in Europe, with Britain tremendously concerned with having the sort of launching pad to Britain and sort of the Netherlands, Belgium, and France be friendly or at least unaffiliated with a power that wants to come at it. And then Germany's wish to assert itself and position at the center of Europe. I mean, that dynamic is, I think, still even worth worrying about in this supposedly peaceful utopia that EU has. But I'd say I'm pro remilitarization of Germany to a degree, but that doesn't mean that it's not a dynamic that should be looked at and thought about. All right. I think we've been doing this for an hour and 40 minutes, which crept up. If you've got any final questions, I would urge you to jump in now or forever hold your peace. I'm very grateful to you all we got 32 watching now. I'm grateful that you all jumped in or watched as much of this as you did. My name is Robert Morris. I run the More Freedom Foundation, a YouTube channel that's trying to save the world. Focusing primarily on geopolitics now, which bugs me a bit. I'd like to get back to some of the U.S. criminal justice issues that caused me to found this channel. Yeah, I am not very consistent with my branding, but I do a lot of stuff on a lot of social media platforms that's fun to participate in, jump in on. I've got a Facebook page, More Freedom Foundation, that I mostly use to repost videos, but I'm very active on Twitter, too active on Twitter, at RoboLaw. You can also follow me on Instagram at The Golden Age, which is mostly just intermittent travel photos. And you can sign up for my email newsletter, which I would recommend you do highly. All these institutions that I use to put stuff out there, from YouTube to Facebook to Google, are unreliable. And there's very real possibility that they just won't work the way I want them to anymore. As I'm lucky that I'm over a certain threshold, but a whole bunch of people who relied on YouTube channels for business purposes were told that they no longer could in recent months. And that didn't happen to me because my channel's big enough now, but it could happen. So that's why I like people to sign up for my email newsletter, because if Google, Facebook, and Amazon decide that I am no longer an appropriate source of news or views, and I disappear, my email newsletter will be the only way that I can keep in touch with you. I have about 300 videos on the channel now. I really only do these sort of live, long conversations, you know, every other week or every month or so. It's mostly more tightly produced, shorter videos that explain an issue much more quickly, sort of 3 to 10 minutes. And thank you all so much for joining me. Everett Michael asks, never talk about Latin America. And yes, I do not talk about Latin America because I don't know enough about it. All right. I think, oh, there's more questions. But I think I've done my sort of closing spiel. It's been an hour and 40 minutes, and I am on I'm on vacation, supposedly. So anyway, thank you guys so much for joining me, and go see Marvel's Avengers. Go see Avengers Infinity War. I enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun. I think that's what we started out talking about today. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me, and have a great day.